proposition. तो मैंने wait for this one. For sure.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. I'm not going to be turning my camera on because we've been having some Wi-Fi issues like yesterday and today. So just for the sake of that. All right. The greatest tragedy of life is not that people die, it's that they never truly live because they're too busy being afraid of dying. We're not saying people will become reckless, we're saying they'll become free. On proposition, we prefer a world where life is defined by meaning and not fear. A key clarification at the top of my speech, then, in this debate, is that in this debate, what we're proving or defending is that people fear death significantly less overall, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be careless with their lives. It doesn't mean they're going to walk into a car or jump off a balcony because people still have a natural survival instinct to protect their lives. It'll look like more when they think about death, they're not going to feel as scared. Or when they think about the ending of their lives, they're not going to feel as scared. Or they'll live their life to the fullest extent and not being afraid of dying. Two arguments in this speech then. First, on why this increases the quality of life, and second, on why it has better practical effects for society. There are a few layers under this first argument. First, people live with less anxiety and more emotional freedom on our side of the house. Right now, much of human suffering comes from the fear of death in the status quo. Not really death itself, because nobody knows actually what happens after death, but the near fear of death. People waste their years trying to avoid aging, illness, or uncertainty because they're terrified of dying. People undergo plastic surgery to get rid of wrinkles on their face. They live their lives in fear, etc. This fear manifests either as chronic anxiety for some people, or at the worst case, paralysis over their life decisions. I'll expand more on this in my second argument and explain why this is going to have practical effects for them and their lives. But when people fear death significantly less, that emotional burden fundamentally disappears. They can focus on living well and not trying to avoid dying 24/7. For instance, in practice, this looks like people will take creative or career risks. They'll travel, they'll express themselves without constantly thinking, what if something happens to me? Removing the fear of death ultimately liberates people psychologically and it allows them to live more presently and meaningfully in the status quo. But this second layer under here is that it fundamentally redefines their priorities and makes life much more authentic. The fear of death often is what pushes people to chase the status, the money, and the security as a coping mechanism to make
Point
the
of
most out of
information.
their lives. No, thank you. People often feel like they want control because they can't control the fact that they're going to die. Because society defines success as well as getting money and a capitalistic lifestyle or having a status in life, for many individuals that want to fulfill their lives, that ends up manifesting in chasing the money or lifestyle when that's not even the core purpose of life. Instead of on the comparative, people may find one core thing they want to focus on and just do it to its fullest no matter what. It could be, for instance, advocating for social change. They're less afraid it's going to end up in them getting involved with the police or a violent protest and dying, so they'll be more likely to carry out to its fullest, and those will have the biggest psychologically beneficial impacts for the people that are going to live their lives on our side of the house. So when that fear of death fades, people stop living for appearances
Point
and
of
actually
information.
start living for themselves and fulfillment. People spend more time with their loved ones, for instance. They pursue their passions to the fullest extent. They contribute to their communities because they're not enslaved by the illusion of permanence. But the third layer here is that it allows people to approach death and aging with dignity. Currently, many people die in fear, in denial, or in regret of their lives because they never accepted the inevitability of death. In this world, people can face death peacefully. They take more time to plan their goodbyes and they appreciate the time that they have left. When people are scared of death, fundamentally, this is the difference. They run away from the problem. They don't even want to discuss the topic with their family members, with their friends, because they're too scared that it's going to happen. But because it's an inevitable part of being a human being, it ultimately has to be done with grace. And the only way to do that is through not being scared of death. The second thing it does is it reduces the trauma for families too. Since loved ones don't have to watch someone suffer from panic and denial at the end of their life, for people grieving, it becomes much easier because you know they weren't scared of what what was coming. You yourself feel more at peace with the fact that dying is not something bad. It is the natural ending of someone's lovely life. This is the kind of thing that we want people to think on our side of the house. Death then
Point of
becomes a
information.
transition. It's not a terrifying event, improving both the quality of life and the quality of them dying at the end of their life as well. A great example of how people are able to live their lives better is in religion, where individuals are not scared of dying because they have an afterlife and somewhere else to go. And instead, they spend their life dedicated to one purpose. That is what we want on our side of the house. But the second argument here is the practical benefits for society. First, people make much more bolder and meaningful choices in their life when they are not scared of death. When people no longer live in fear of death, they are more willing to stand up for their values. For instance, this looks like fighting injustices, taking hard moral stances, and sacrificing for other people that they love or they don't even know. A great example of this is Malala Yousafzai, where she was not afraid of death and stood up for what she believed in for free education for women. These are the kinds of people we need in society in order to make it a better place for everybody that is living. Today, too many people are staying silent or staying complacent out of the fact that they want to self-preserve themselves. Without overwhelming fear of this death or self-preservation, people are actually able to act with more courage and bravery. The impact is just very simple. Society actually gains braver individuals. They gain whistleblowers, humanitarians, reformers, people that go against the government, people that take hard moral stances, people like Martin Luther King who drive moral progress rather than trying to stay away from danger all the time or stay away from the causes they truly believe in because they're afraid of getting hurt or dying. Second, we think that there is
Point
far
of
more innovation
information.
and far more advancement economically. No, thank you. The fear of death ultimately limits exploration. You don't want to live a bad life leading to your death. Things like whether quitting your job may not lead to having an income, leading to homelessness, leading to death. People make decisions thinking that they're going to die because of something, and they never try because they're too scared of living a bad life and dying or wasting that life. They never take that risk to live the life that they actually want. They never take that passionable, like, they never switch or quit their job because they want to do something else like social justice or art or music, things like this. They don't do that because they're scared of living a bad life and ultimately scared of dying. They're far more likely to take this risk on our side of the house. Ambitious projects with innovation, they're likely to bite the bullet on it and say, let's just do it. We don't have that much time. We're going to die anyway. Let's just do it. Third, we think that it reduces overtreatment in healthcare. Doctors scared that they'll lose someone, that someone will die, are now more willing to take that risk on a surgery, a life-saving surgery, or something like this. But note, doctors are still trained under the same system and still will suggest all options when necessary. We aren't saying doctors are going to make more rash, harsh decisions, but we are saying when it comes to them having to make a decision in a timely manner, they're going to be able to do this much faster because they're not scared of dying or they're not scared of losing their patient anymore. But families also, more importantly, are likely to be able to make that decision, take that risk, take the surgery which saves someone's life rather than keeping them on life support. In the status quo, lots of families don't do that because they're scared of losing them. They're scared of death. But when you're not scared of death, you're going to be able to take that risky decision. Even if it's the right decision to keep someone on life support, families are more willing to at least consider the choice or stop the treatment so patients are more willing to be better off on our side of the house. That's why we're so proud to propose.
Thank you, first proposition, for the fine speech. Next, first up.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
I'll be starting my speech in three, two, one. Judge, humanity is selfish, humanity is stupid. The fear of death is the psychological barrier that prevents humans from committing excessive crime and ruining the fabric of society. It is not a dooming anchor that prevents people from interacting with society itself. Instead, side opposition posits that the fear of death is the fundamental driving force to ensure society continues to value life as it is and function as it does without compromising on human utility, so proud to oppose. First, let's talk about some framing because this is where we win this debate. Let's talk about what it's like to fear death. Fearing death is a primal instinct. So when they say that a survival instinct remains on their side, they're wrong because ultimately the survival instinct hinges on the fact that you don't want to die. That is the fear of death. This is an instinct that is based on not dying, so you can't just fundamentally change it on your side of the house. And as a person, why do you think death is so scary? Because two reasons. You probably believe that the most important thing is that after death, there's nothing beyond. That is what makes death the most horrifying thing in the world. That it's permanent. You have no agency to change what happens after death. You can come back from broken bodies and destroyed reputations, but never the end of your own life. There's no hope and there's inevitable doom. And to be clear, a fear of death is not the same as a fear of pain. The only truly unique harm of death is its permanence, so this framing is more nuanced on our side of the house and should be accepted. The main consequence of this is that people want to avoid death, but also that the time that they have alive now becomes sacred because they say that people want to run away from the truth. But consider two things. This fear is based on our evolutionary need to realize that which hurts you and then seek it to address so that your species can ultimately survive. And secondly, you avoid it because that scares you to not ignore it. They cannot assert that people actually don't do this on our side of the house. And next, in response to their framing, it is not a constant fear because human minds actually develop copium to the fact that there's this permanent thing looming over your head, so you selectively place emphasis on things. Death is mostly emphasized when you're about to die or make a relevant decision. You don't always think about the fact that you're going to die unless you're making a decision that will decide it so. And to be clear, it isn't an absolute fear. People can still come up with things with religion like they need to. Bravery still exists on our side of the house. Malala didn't stand up to death, and her sacrifice was made meaningful by the fact that she confronted a fundamental fear of humanity. Next, the flip is that people who do not fear death either believe that there's something beyond or that the finality of the end of life is not impressed upon them, so may place themselves in more risky situations when considering what to do. The impact of death is less relevant in their mind, so they take more risks or they're more willing to justify their death in the first place. So your logic actually just feeds into this, so we're glad for that. Next, what are the counter incentives in this debate? We have personal recklessness, because there's human desires to explore and experiment when there's the lack of the fear of death. Strong emotions like love and anger, ideology, and social narratives, things like social pressure and peer pressure, etc. These all exist on both sides of the house. And obviously, we know that in some cases, a fear of death is insufficient, but we think we still comparatively increase rationality here. We are balancing this effect. Our stance is simple, that a fear of death is the only unifying mechanism to balance these rationalities. Now, on to some rebuttals. They said that people who advocate for more social change, this is wrong. The fact that you value lives equally and value them in the first place is due to its limited nature. You don't fear death. You do not care that people are dying of starvation because there isn't any empathy that occurs because you do not relate with their human condition in the first place. Empathy hinges on the fear of death. You only feel empathetic because you fear for their own life, which is limited because it is being wasted despite its sacrosanct nature. You need to have a fear of death to feel empathetic and engage in philanthropy in the first place. So we flip the entire substantive. All the examples on Martin Luther King and Malala are to us. Next, they said that people find happiness on their side of the house. This is wrong. Firstly, people don't indulge in capitalistic hedonistic desires because of a fear of death, rather because of a biological instincts warped by capitalism itself. Note that this is actually worse on top. Your hedonistic desires are no longer counterbalanced by a fear of death. It's actually dominating, so you don't care about eating like crazy and taking drugs because you have no fear for your death when your health eventually declines. Next, they also say they rather do things that fulfill them, and ultimately on our side of the house, they value the lives around them because they see its sacrosanct nature of its permanence. They don't engage in hedonism, which is externally damaging. Next, even if they do, we think this is good. Like people getting plastic surgery or doing makeup because they don't want to have wrinkles is good because it makes them happy, doesn't harm anyone else. We prioritize this. Next, they said that on their side of the house, they give more economic benefit. This is wrong because people actually get less economic benefit on your side of the house. Because the reason why innovation happens is because people fear death. And they're so scared of dying a sad death. It's why they innovate and explore. It's why John Keats started writing his groundbreaking poetry because he knew he was going to die of consumption. He was scared of that and wanted to make the best use of his life by writing poems. Next, you said that doctors would take more risky surgeries, but if you care less about the patient's death, you're going to offer more risky surgeries, which have much more higher adverse outcomes. Outside the issue, while having risky surgeries and having higher mortality rates on average, the issue is the doctor's intruding presence on your life. The doctor fearing the patient's death less means that they suggest more risky surgeries, where the patient feels pressure to accept. You only hurt the individual when you incentivize the doctors to be more coercive in forcing riskier outcomes, thus restricting the individual agency. Moving on to my substantives on why people treasure their lives more. Firstly, tier 1. Why is fear important? Fear of death keeps you alive, grounds you in this world. It is constant because as long as you're alive, you fear death. It is more powerful than most things. You don't think about it always unless you're making a decision. It is a counterbalancing emotion to most things that might lead you to die in these very moments. Next, they probably would say, oh, but people consider other things independently. They will all stay alive for the kids. The point is that these incentives are inconsistent and not universal. They may be special duties owed to others, but not everyone else. Like, for example, the drunk driver may be a single man who crashes his car into another. They can be overridden. Like, in a moment of misery, you don't think rationally and commit suicide, where fear of death will have kept you alive until your family comes and talks to you and keeps you alive. In their world, People treat life with more flippancy. It's more possible for you to justify risking your life, for instance. You experiment more with drugs, drinking, and driving. There's more crime because the ability of law enforcement to shoot and kill is what gives the police weighing in many cases. They what gives people to fear to not retaliate against the police. What does this mean? And outside the house, people treasure your lives more. You don't deny yourself expectations and experiences. You treasure each second you have living because life is sacrosanct. You reduce negative externalities from dying early. You harm, like let's say if you die, you harm your child who has to go to orphanage, etc. You may hurt others in the process of dying from inflicted trauma and emotional distress. And lastly, altruism of a legacy effect, because you fear that the endlessness of death and believe that they'll be forever unable to achieve purpose there. Because as you seek to leave impact in the world, this is why outside the house we have philanthropy. Firstly, because of empathy, and secondly, because of the legacy effect. I move on to my second substantive on why there'll be more war on their side of the house. Why more happens? War is born out of patriotism. Most people are patriotic until the point where their life is concerned. Most people celebrate their country's national days, etc., but they don't join the military just because of that. As rational agents, they weigh how much they value their life over their country's like progress. And when they value their life significantly, they will choose their country, but they won't engage in brash acts. But now, the loss of the individual valuation of self would lead to increased military conscription. People will voluntarily want to join the military. And this can manifest in other ways. I have 5 impacts. Firstly, now, people vote for politicians who are more patriotic and value self over country. Like most right-wing politicians, the spread of right-wing politics is bad for societal welfare in general. More rich taxes, more worker exploitation, more discrimination, etc. Next, the politicians are now more susceptible to violent sentiment by telling people during times of crisis they feel that their country is threatened and feel like there should be escalation, and because they indirectly lead to war. Next, politicians who want to get into power appeal to these emotions of patriotism by valuing their country over the sense of self. People like this because they do not value themselves either. They value their country more than themselves. They feel that their country is threatened and they actually vote these politicians into power. It is easier for nations to get into war and justify large military spending as well. Next, fourthly, countries want to expand their sphere of influence. They see military as a sort of investment for increasing their country's growth, etc. And lastly, fifthly, countries want to preemptively protect their countries from invasion, especially in smaller countries when their sovereignty is threatened. Next, my next on why more war is bad. This is pretty self-explanatory. Death is bad because we value life and we can agree on both sides that we value our life. Less international relations. You'll have more nationalist and protective people like Trump, and the far right taking control, as I've explained, is bad. What is our counterfactual? We have status quo. There's still IR. Yes, wars exist, but there's no extreme proliferation like there is inside proposition's side. Our wars can be ended because international relationships exist. Conversation exists between countries because people value their lives and the values of those after them. There's a long-term view of people's lives. And on their side of the house, their wars are bloody, their wars are brutal, because people are driven by blind passion and have no fear of their own death, and they're driven by the only patriotism for their home and land. They lack the long-term vision, they lack the externalities. For all the reasons, so proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank to the first supposition for the fine speech. Now calling upon second prop.
Give me a moment to set up my timer, please. Thank you. Okay, I'll be starting on my first word. Judge, notice that the majority of the opposition's analysis deals with the fact that people can grapple with the idea that death will ultimately happen. Not once did they specifically engage with the analysis in terms of the fear of death, and thus, I think all the analysis that they told us still applies to our side of the house. I'll be explaining this further later on. Proud to propose. At the very top of my speech, I want to deal with the framing about what exactly it means to fear death. I think our analysis on the primal instinct and why people still have the idea to be able to self-preserve to some extent is still inherent, because primal instinct is something you can fundamentally not change, and that's why the motion says that people fear death a lot less rather than people just don't fear death at all. But secondly, I want to talk about the idea of why exactly fear of death balances irrationalities and why empathy hinges on fear of death. I think that honestly this is probably not true, because things like empathy and things like irrationalities, they don't necessarily only hinge on the idea that you're afraid to die. Empathy, for example, hinges on the idea that you want to make good connections with people. You don't want to feel like a loner in society. And this is not necessarily because you think you're going to die of loneliness, for example. That's probably not the first instinct of people in general society. society. Like, you don't make friends because you're like, I'm gonna die lonely if I have no friends. Therefore, empathy and other things probably hinge on different other narratives in society that are still going to be coexistent on our side of the house. For example, empathy also hinges on the fact that you just want to be a better person to yourself. You feel good when you are empathetic. For example, you also don't do irrational things, like you might not like smoke and drink 24/7 if you were never in that nature, by virtue of the fact that you don't want to get the side effects of like not being able to wake up the next day to go to your job, for example. All of these other factors that are literally social constructs that can exist independent of whether or not someone is fundamentally afraid of death 24/7 can still exist on our side of the house, which means
Point
that
of
the fear
information.
of death doesn't necessarily like outbalance irrationality. No, thank you. But then I want to talk about the innovation point, because they told us that innovation only happens when individuals fear death. I think this is not necessarily like true. I think innovation does in fact like happen when people do not fear death, because the moment at which you are afraid of death is the moment at which you put a ticking time bomb on your life, and that ticking time bomb dictates when and where you can do projects, when and where you can make certain decisions, and you have to think about the cost benefit analysis of what you think things are going to be better for your life or not. But often, a lot of decisions made are arbitrary because people can never predict what
Point of
will happen in
information.
their life. And for that very reason, it is often that the decisions you never make, you never know what would have happened, even if they had a net good in the first place. But then, I want to talk about why exactly their analysis necessarily doesn't even deal with the factor of like being afraid of death in itself. Everything that the previous speaker literally just said doesn't occur because people are scared of death. It is because that they know that death will ultimately happen. Death happens on both sides, just. So the analysis of why people like still do good things or why people are still benevolent will still exist. They cannot just say that people don't fear death on their side of the house and that people will get out of fearing death through understanding that death will occur one day or another. Before I move on, yes, I'll take a point.
If doing drugs makes you happy, then why don't people do lots of drugs in the real world?
Wait, but people already do lots of drugs in the real world anyway, and I would argue that like the government already tries to regulate it to some extent. I don't understand the point. Moving on then. I would argue that opposition was therefore not defending their burden. They have to defend people actively fearing death because that is the world you're arguing for. Everything they just now analyzed was not on the fear of death, but the pure fact that death will happen. People write books at the end of their life not because they are scared of death necessarily, but because they know that they're going to die soon, because they know that death is a fact, and that is why they want to put their work out into the real world. They need to defend that burden strictly. But then I want to talk about like the specific like analysis of like the experimentation with more drugs and more third-party harms. First of all, I just want to note that like the experimentation with like drugs and things already happen in current day society when there is a trend of fearing death in like the most crucial moments. Like for example, on cigarette packets, like there are literally images of like someone's throat rotting, and all of these things make you reminded that death is a thing, and yet people still do it. That is probably to say that even on their side of the house, when people do in fact fear death, a lot of these things that are like just very inherent to the things around us, like the fact that drugs are inherently addictive, or the fact that like there's already so much exposure to bad things in the world, like child pornography, for example. All of these exposures just mean that at the end of the day, even the fear of death cannot suppress any of these things so long as somebody is correctly exposed to a large amount of these bad things to begin with. They needed to prove why exactly this is likely to decrease a lot more on their side of the house anyway. On our side of the house, I would argue, even if we bite the bullet and say that, yes, maybe some more people choose to experiment with drugs or whatever, I think that is all right, because it creates a further incentive for a government to ensure that for the choice that people make, whether they want to engage with cigarettes or alcohol or just drugs in general, that means the government will have to create more leverage to make sure that people will still have a good quality of life, even if they choose to make this decision to experiment anyway, because that still fulfills the right to autonomy and the right to experimenting with your own life in the way that you want. Four more things then. First of all, I just want to reiterate the idea that death is literally a capitalistic societal construct. It is by virtue of the fact that people exist because they want to make meaning in their life. They want to create purpose in the things that they do, in the businesses that they create. And by virtue of the fact that society's main metric of success is to make money, because we frame that money is the prerequisite to accessing everything else in society. That is the reason why death literally drives you toward capitalism. That is the reason why a lot of people literally slave away at their work office every single day of the week, and they don't even necessarily live a happy life because they feel like this is the only way they will leave a mark on the world before they inevitably die. That is what the fear of death causes. But second of all, I want to flip like the argument on like why exactly people are likely to be worse on our side of the house. I just don't think that this is necessarily true. Ava gave you the analysis of religion. It is by virtue of the fact that somebody who is Christian, for example, believes in heaven, believes that death is not something you necessarily have to be afraid of because there's something else beyond waiting for you. That is why it inherently makes people a lot less anxious about their lives. It makes people a lot less selfish because if you were selfish in your life, you would have tried to give all the resources to yourselves. But people who are religious and who believe in heaven, they think it is okay if you give out some of your money, if you give out some of your food, because ultimately you will go somewhere divine and death is not inherently scary. You don't have a ticking time bomb dictating your life. Yeah, finally I want to talk about the more death and war thing. I don't necessarily think we're going to get more war because like people will still have the same cost and benefit analysis. For example, like you don't want to leave your family for an extended period of time, or you need to go to university, for example. Even if more people join the military, it's good because deterrence is increased, and it's not like countries will just go to war because if everybody literally dies, there's still going to be international backlash, and war is still not, it doesn't fulfill the fundamentality of human rights. Finally, in my speech, I want to talk about the unique benefit of catharsis that we give to individuals. Note, when people are not as afraid of dying, people will also find it a lot easier to grieve the people who do die. I think this is a net benefit because the majority of times in which people become depressed is when they constantly grieve someone who has died. And this is not to say that grieving is bad, but it just makes grieving a lot easier for the people in our world. For example, the only reason you grieve for a very, very long period of time is because you think of death as something that is horrible. Society portrays death as a horrible social contrast and something that is internally hellish. But on our side of the house, when people think of it as something that is not as bad, something that might lead to a better afterlife, for example, that is a moment in which you're able to conceptualize that death for your family member does not necessarily mean something that is innately horrible and something that you will never be able to get over. On our side of the house, the quality of life increases and people become fundamentally more free when they're living. For these reasons, propose.
Thank you, second proposition, for the fine speech. Next to second op.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep, loud and clear.
Wait, just give me a second. Unless proposition is added on drugs for delivering their speech, which may be possible, it's not true that people are on drugs all the time in status quo. The fact is, people aren't on them because they're scared of overdosing and of dying. It's the reason why people who had a near-death experience and experienced that fear choose to stay away from it. Note here, it's comparative and it's less, not symmetric. People do less reckless things on our side, we win on this. I'm going to get into a few pieces of clarification before I get to the clashes. One, the fear of death is a counterbalancing force against strong emotions. We prove to you why this is a far better counter-narrative. It's not that you can just squirrel and pointing to emotion and saying, hey, it's significantly less. The fact is, the fear of death is no longer that powerful, meaning it's no longer that primal. It's no longer that primal factor that supersedes other strong emotions. It means it's the ability for you to be more persuaded by patriotism, by right-wing ideology, by, I don't know, your radical love, your hedonistic tendencies, or whatsoever. Because I'm no longer counterbalanced by, oh no, I might die, and thinking of, no, let's go and defend my country. Let me go and fight the Tutsi militia because I deserve, I need to protect my community and whatsoever. They say our analysis is non-responsive because it deals with the fact that death exists, and I don't really get that. We can see that death exists on both sides of the house, but the fear of death is what influences your reality to the reality, your response to this reality. If you fear it, then it's important, then it's scary. You won't do dangerous things because you're scared of the outcome. If you don't fear it, then you just don't care as much, then you don't factor it as much into the decision making. That's why the cost-benefit analysis they talk so much is warped. That's the delta. To which extent is it that the cost-benefit analysis has changed, that I'm going to prioritize getting the risk, the restlessness, and the reward from this rather than the fear of death. Two clashes for you on indiv, then on society. Firstly, on the individual. On philanthropy, really quickly. They say empathy is driven by the fear of loneliness. No, empathy means that you're able to put yourself in the shoes of others and to feel compassion for the human conditions. You won't feel compassion when you don't value your life. How can you care about dying children in wars when your valuation of the life itself is so low? When you don't empathize, it means you get like higher levels of crime. You get less philanthropy. You get less mental health awareness. We want to talk about that because you can't actually care about other people's mental health. You need empathy to understand that. You need to understand that empathy is inherent to the value of life. You need to accept that with the dilution of the value of life, you have a significant decrease in empathy as well. If you do not value your own life, why will you value the lives of others? Next, they say that people should be given more choices to do things like harm themselves, take reckless acts, whatsoever. But choices are only valid if they're A, made with proper information, and B, devoid of third-party harms. On the first point, you don't know what happens after you die, therefore you can never have a very truly valid choice to choose to die. But secondly, on third-party harms, we just proved to you that there are so many externalities in terms of war, in terms of, for example, drunk driving, accidentally hitting a person, that if you do decide to take this reckless act, it is morally wrong, and we should stop this from happening by choosing opposition. Next, on grief. I want to note, you lose out on the ability to grieve because you don't care about your parents' death. You don't care about whatever happens. And this is generally horrid. Whatever they say is horrid. Grief is good. You should be able to feel sad. You should be able to go and find this level of catharsis because there is a level of reconciliation that will never be able to be found on proposition side. Next, I want to get into on societal impacts. Few points here. One, on war. The point of why war is so scary is because people die. The reason why I'm so terrified of when I watch war films, when I watch Dunkirk, for example, is because I see these people brutalized. I see the loss of life. I see them being utterly splattered in blood. And I fear that because blood, the reason for fact we fear blood is because it's a primal instinct, survival instinct, because we often associate blood with death and we have this unknown weird fear of death. So the problem then is that war and these things happen is because people are often counteracted by fear of death that makes them unable to do this. I want to make this very, very clear. It's this point of strong emotions. The point is we are coerced by strong emotions all the time. Not necessarily that it's bad, but rather that these strong emotions often lead to outcomes that we rather not happen. It is the issue, for example, with why patriotism is allowed to take root. It's because of the fact that you don't fear your death as much that you care about fighting for your country. But on that, actually, I want to extend on it on two ways. In two ways. Firstly, on the point that they don't actually respond to my first speaker's point on the idea of far-right radicalism. The problem here is that if you care less about your own lives, if you have less empathy, and you are less honestly grounded by the idea of the fear of death, and more persuaded by the strong emotion of patriotism, you're more willing to buy into such rhetoric because you don't really care about, oh wait, what about the fear? And honestly, as they said, if you're going to go and be more free, you're going to do whatever, that means you're going to be taking more radical actions. I think that's quite a intuitive corollary. Therefore, you're more willing to be buying into these things. And I think it's quite clear why the far-right radicalism, why the anti-immigration policies are so bad. Lastly, on the second point here, the issue is on the weighing. I want to make this very, I'm going to point this out. The severity of war justifies its harm. Not only is it that the possibility of war is so harmful because it leads to the death of millions, but it's also the fact that even if it's a slim chance, we rather not take it. So they can mitigate all they want. They can say, and if they say that, sure, and we'll bite the bullet, that maybe it's not as persuasive of a factor that denies you from going to war. But the fact that even if you increase it by 1 to 2% chance, that is such a horrifying thought that we rather not take it on side opposition as a risk-adverse as a gang. Next, on economic impacts, they don't actually prove why people want to make the most of their life without the fear of death. In fact, a significant ability of a significant form of meaning formation in life is through the fear of death. It is through the fact that I know my life is finite, and I'm scared of having wasted my potential. I'm scared of dying with doing nothing off. I don't need to slave away at your job because you're scared of death. If I'm so scared that I've wasted my life, if I'm so scared that I have left no impact on the world at all, then I'm going to be more willing to take this action, actually. I'm more willing to go and write the poetry. I'm more likely to explore, etc. So I don't really get how they push on this. Actually, on the idea of Christianity, I just want to make a quick note. They confuse and conflate causation with effect. Christians are typically happier because they have a lack of connection with the material world because of the fact that, Christian and have greater empathy because, Christianity supports this about like loving your neighbor, etc. But the issue then is that when you don't actually think too much about death, when you believe in an afterlife, there is a lack of material connection to the real world, which is something that does happen if you want to go and point at religion, for example. There's a lack of actually care in regards to caring about material conditions. There's a lack of care for suffering, for example, because you always think, hey, there will always be an afterlife. So I don't really get this point here. Lastly, on the idea of risk-taking, which is going to be my substantive 3 on an extension, why is the fear of death a hedge against risk?
One, the cost-benefit analysis is warped, and I'll repeat this time and time again. Risk is a fear of loss, and the greatest loss is death. It's the loss of the soul. It's the loss of agency. That's why people actually fear death. So secondly, death is acting as a warning system of sorts. It's like your nervous system in pain. It discourages you from threatening behavior. You're more reticent because there are greater things to consider. You think about outcomes more. You're less persuaded by stronger emotions. You activate your survival instinct, but more importantly, your short-term bias fails to overwhelm you because there's a greater concern of the long run. There's a greater concern over how death is the final stop, and you're worried about that. So next, why is this level of risk-taking so harmful? Firstly, I think as my first speaker said, it encourages more reckless action. But to extend on Raj's point on drunk driving, as just not only on the idea of third-party harms, it's also the idea that it becomes more coercive. You suggest more risky actions to your friends and to your peers. You think this to be morally right. You impose upon others. It's from offering the risky surgery that he talked about to offering drugs to your friends because you care less about your death and their death. So coercion in this is actually worse, and you actually restrict a level of agency because you have supported coercive factors in society. Secondly, you increase the idea of speculative investment. If you want to talk about the economy, I'll deal with this. You're more likely to take reckless investment because the cost-benefit analysis is wrong. You feel speculative bubbles because you're attracted far more by powerful emotions of greed and hedonism rather than being grounded by your fear of loss and death. You don't you don't really care too much about the possibilities of losing it all, or dying on the streets, of being unable to find your healthcare, etc. Which means overall you're likely to go and lead to more speculative bubbles. You're supporting the tulip industry, the Dutch tourism industry. You're supporting the AI bubble, etc. Because you keep thinking about their risk, their glory, etc. instead of their fear. But thirdly, you just buy less investment and insuring. That's just risky and worse. If you don't care about death, you don't really care about getting harmed, etc. You don't care about what's going to happen in the future. You don't care that much about getting this hedge against risk. So in our world, you at least get less risk taking and you get a level of groundedness which prevents you from being influenced by other external factors. I'm so proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, second opposition, for the fine speech. Next, third prof.
Just give me just give me a second to start my timer, please. Yeah, if everyone's ready. Judge, I want to preface the speech by saying that you still value your life. That still happens on both sides. We just think that on opposition, you're plagued by a constant reminder of death, which ultimately means that you cannot live your life properly. For that reason, propose 2 clash points. First, which side makes people feel more fulfillment in their lives? And second, I'm going to be talking about this entire argument about war and conflict and innovation and things like this. First, then, which side makes people feel more fulfillment in their lives? Before I deal with the arguments about the value of life and the limited nature of death, I want to deal with this argument from opposition about personal recklessness, where the fear of death is primal and you're just going to do a bunch of stupid things. First of all, I think that we can frame out very, very idiotic things in this debate because of the fact that it is literally in your genes, like what opposition said, to not burn yourself or to not crash your car, to not walk into the car as a pedestrian or something like that, because it is wired in your brain. You have automatic reflexes for this. It's not that you fear it, it's that it's genetically in you. But second, we think that when they talk about things like drugs and smoking and suicide, that people do this more on our side of the house. Because they don't care about death. I think that this isn't necessarily true because you have other factors that deter you from doing this. Like my second speaker mechanized, things like social stigma about doing drugs or smoking, or the fact that your life is literally more uncomfortable for you when you live, because when you smoke, you literally have no ability to breathe and you start coughing all the time. It's not necessarily because of death. It's not that you think you're gonna have lung cancer, it's because your parents will literally I don't know, reprimand you for it. So therefore, we think that things like this, there are other factors that deter you from doing this. But I want to note here, Judge, in the worst case scenario, if people do this so much on our side of the house, even if it is true that people do this more, and here's the weighing, what's the issue? They feel happier, they enjoy doing it. The reason that people are unable to live their lives properly is because they're scared about death. We think that it is okay if they want to do things like drugs or smoke because it is them living their life. It is them enjoying their life. On their side, people never do this because they're just simply always scared about their imminent death. Second, we think that you value life. They said that you value life
Point of
because of its
information.
limited nature. But first, realize, Judge, that this isn't because of the fear of death, but because death happens anyways, and that life is obviously limited because death happens. They need to support a world in which people actively fear death because that is the motion. The motion claims that people fear death on their side of the house. It isn't just that people can personally cope to this, because that is basically supporting our side of the house where there is no fear of death. But second, we think that even if you value life because of its limited nature, it is likely to be very superficial because you make risk-averse decisions, as they say. What does this mean? Things like not quitting your job because you're scared that it leads to homelessness and death. Things like not doing that bungee jump you've always wanted to do because you're scared that it somehow is going to make you die. But also, fear often causes avoidance about this fear. Like they said, people cope to this. How do they cope to these thoughts that literally dominate you? They avoid it. They are likely to do things that distract themselves through routine. That is when people face grief, they overwork themselves and it's likely to paralyze people where they cling to safety rather than seeking joy. They just keep working and they don't spend their time properly. But third, we also think that people are more likely to have a sustainable appreciation for life on our side of the house. Because on their side, realize that it is kind of a panic that you suddenly need to tick off everything on your bucket list because you're like, well, God, I'm gonna die. But it is really about having a form of long-term well-being on our side of the house, appreciating small daily things, feeling peace with not doing anything, like instead of doing it just in blast. We think that this is a form of deeper joy because fear just simply makes life more frantic, where you're more anxious and therefore are forced to do these kind of things just because you think you're gonna die. Rather, you like enjoy just doing nothing in your life too. But then they said, well, people are gonna be more short-termist. Yeah, we think that's fine. We think that it means that you maximize your happiness because you do things that benefit short-term you. There are other incentives to not do bad things, as we say, but we think that the benefits outweigh the harms because we think
Point of
it's more
information.
likely to maximize your happiness, not right now. Therefore, Judge, we think that people are still likely to feel psychologically better on our side of the house because they don't chase money and status and jobs to make the most out of life because that is what society values, and instead they chase like what they want to do. They feel liberated for this. But also, Judge, I think they haven't responded arguably to a most important argument on this. We think that grief feels easier. There's less trauma. Like, realize that this fear literally eats up your life and it makes you like really depressed that someone's gone from your life. Yes, you'll still feel bad on our side of the house, but it's easier to deal with grief when it's not feared because there's something else waiting for your parents. Like, you still care about your parents' death because you care about your parents, but we think you feel less grief because you're not scared about their death because you think that they have a better place to go to. The fact that you value other people's life is not because of you're scared of death, but because we value life
Yeah,
in
point of
things
information.
like we care about suffering. No, life is still valuable because of the scarcity of time and not death. But what is the weighing here, Judge? We think that even if it is true that people are more short-termist, even if it is true that people are likely to do more drugs, we still think that people are like happier on our side of the house because we think that other factors really limit the amount of bad things that people are going to do. We've told you about other societal pressures. We've told you about other kinds of ways that stop people and limit people from doing these kind of negative things that they claim. So we think that it isn't true that people are just going to go all out and do all of this, but we think we can like severely limit it. So we think the scale of what they're doing isn't as much. But B, in the worst case scenario, we think that at least people are going to be happy on our side of the house because they are plagued by constant fear that eats them up. We think that ultimately on our side of the house, you're able to live life in a much more peaceful way rather than just simply thinking about your impending death because that is literally what they do on opposition. But now I want to talk about this argument like about in my second flashpoint about innovation, war, and conflict, basically the effect on society. What do they say? They said that more war will happen. But realize, Judge, the reason why we don't go to war isn't because of a fear of death. It's because it literally breaks down economies. It breaks down governmental system. It's not only because of death. Like, people in military have consented to death anyways. So it's not about being scared of dying. And also realize the governments face an insane amount of criticism if everyone goes and dies on the battlefield. But honestly, Judge, even if This is going to sound very counterintuitive, but even if it is true that more war will happen, it's not completely bad. Realize that sometimes you need war because it means that your cost-benefit analysis is probably better on our side of the house because we anyways values a human's life, and this taints, and a fear of death taints whether we should go to war or not. We think the cost-benefit analysis is more rational on our side of the house because no fear of death counters the fact that you always value human life. There are some instances where we need to go to war, and we think that we're much more able to do that on our side of the house. Like, for example, in Rwanda and Mogadishu, where we didn't intervene in Rwanda because of Mogadishu, and the entire genocide happened. There are times when we actually need to go to war. We think this doesn't taint this. But realize, Judge, that they haven't dealt with our argument about the effect on society. We think that in general, people are likely to be more innovative on our side of the house because they're willing to take that risk. They aren't stuck in what society tells them to do because that is what is right. They try to make, we think on opposition, they try to make decisions in what they think is right, and what society thinks is right. And we think that because of that, they're completely shackled to the idea of what is right. But instead, on our side of the house, we think that they're much more likely to take the non-normal route that may achieve better in life. So we think we're likely to make people take more risks in their careers, take more risks in their life, and therefore live a happier life because of that. For that reason, propose.
Thank you, third proposition, for the fine speech. Next to third op.
Hello there, friend. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
It's so warm, bro. As well. Zach. Speech in 3, 2. When I was 7, and this is a true story, by the way, I had an existential breakdown in my house because I had an epiphany about my own mortality. And I can tell you guys that I realized what it was like to die, or that I would die, and I was really, really, really scared. What my mother did at the time was to read me this poem about death, and it was called How Did You Die? I'm not going to get into it, but basically it wasn't about how death was something to run away from. It was about how we need to make the most of our lives. I think fearing death is simply about trying to do what we can while we're alive so that we can be proud of ourselves as we walk bravely into an abyss that is terrifying, but an abyss that we must all face. I have 2 clashes. The first on the fear of death and then on the practical. Under this first clash, 2 questions. 1, why do people fear death? 2, how does this fear manifest? What do we hear from Gov? They say people just blindly don't want to die. It's really what we hear. And I think it's kind of sad that they don't provide nuance, right? What we say is that people uniquely fear the permanence of death. This is important, judges, because we give you a unique harm of death, a unique thing that is bad about death that we think people would therefore fixate on. Their fear of death, when you remove it, is no longer as all-encompassing in someone's mind. They say that, oh, but actually this is a primal instinct, right? And I think, fine, let's take them at their best, right? There is a primal instinct, but this is something that operates only on a very proximate level. Like they said, I dodge a car now. The problem is the fear of death is something that we think is relevant that needs to change your incentives in the long term before you go past the point of no return. This fear produces exclusive changes in behavior that isn't just about the fact that I know death exists. I need this fear to motivate me to actually act to prevent this death from happening. So at their best, they can say there's some fear, but it's no good for you to feel really, really scared as your car is already careening off the cliff. We need the fear to pierce all the way to the earlier point in time when you were making the decision to take alcohol. You need to realize then there's a risk that I may die if I drink and I drive, so I am not going to do it. Why is this necessary? Because we framed from the beginning that other things exist. We live in a world with very strong emotions that may override our rationality. We live in a world where we can be influenced by the rhetoric and the lies that other people say. And this takes out so much of the mitigation they want to have. Because they say that war doesn't happen because people want to study, because of your hospitals break down. These are good things. Yes, these are rational reasons. But rational reasons can be overridden by ideological incentives, as we've seen in so many of the religious wars being fought when I'm sure they also worried about their systems breaking down, but still they fight. Because ideology and anger can overwhelm these things, we think death is the single death is the single incentive that is not fleeting, that is not immutable. This is a comparative debate. That we say that in a world without this fear, more war happens, right? And that every new war constitutes millions of deaths, and that is a terrible thing. It doesn't matter whether or not war is good or not in a vacuum. The problem is that on average, you still get more war and more death. It is the reason why nuclear war hasn't happened in America, despite the fact that you have Trump spreading rhetoric everywhere, because a massive aversion to dying is what means that he's incapable of ever actually convincing people. What do they say? People want to avoid risk, but they don't actually do enough work here. Like if you take the average logical person, they're not going to cease riding planes or driving. This is a status quo debate. People still do these things although the risk of dying maybe it's marginally higher than walking along a safe highway, like please be charitable. That like the whole idea of quitting your job so you won't starve, it doesn't make sense. At best, we can see maybe you hesitate, right? But I think that's not really a bad thing. You're actually considering the options of being practical here. The most reasonable way to interpret this fear is to say that people will be averse to actions that may logically increase the risk of dying by a set threshold. But the threshold is not zero. People aren't going to be completely paralyzed because any potential action could lead to death. This is unrealistic. I'm going to deal with that biggest approach, which is that you enjoy life more. So why can people actually still enjoy life on our side of the house? They exaggerate this completely. First, many enjoyments just don't involve death at all. I can make friends, I can play with them, I can go to a debate competition with them, go to a board game cafe, take a holiday. These are all things that are hugely beneficial for happiness. They need to prove an exclusive benefit to like taking drugs. Guys, the only thing we hear is that mere optionality, but we tell you this is insignificant. Optionality is only valuable, pure choice is only valuable insofar as you can guarantee that it is logical and that there is no third-party harm. We spend so much of our speeches telling you about the huge third-party harm that you create. So all you do in the previous speech is repeat this. So I don't think I need to add anything more. It's just not a proper response. But secondly, that people can deal with their fear. Look, I am actually pretty afraid of like failing my A-levels in the future because I'm debating too much, but that doesn't mean I'm constantly afraid about it. From the fact that everyone right now isn't depressed by the fact that they're going to die, as they assert, we can tell that people are kind of logical animals that are able to mentally shelve this fear when it is irrelevant, even if it is something that is very real and tangible to them. Note, this does not contradict our material about the fear of death being pressing. It merely means that it is pressing at the point at which death is looming when it seems like an immediate and relevant issue. What did they say? That like people will feel deep joy from what they do in their life. Yeah, we can do this. This is totally symmetric. Why would anxiety about death leave me unable to enjoy like a debate comp that I'm doing? There's no logical link. There are many things in our life which supersede the fear of death. People can love each other to the extent that they may not even care as long as they can die together. All these things in the status quo already exist. They never prove that it doesn't exist on our side. The last thing is it's just like people are grieving. But again, they never prove that grief is so terrible. We think it's a natural coping process and that's something that you can easily opt out of. For example, your family can reassure you over time, you can go to therapists, etc. So it's not a big impact on their side. So the easy way is this, that maybe in our world, people don't experience a full range of experiences. But first, these experiences are not unique. You can do other things that make you happy. They never prove why it's like so harmful on their side. But secondly, these experiences are not as important. The pleasure you may gain from drinking when you're the designated driver is not as important as avoiding the main harm that you may or may not go off a cliff or crash into a bunch of other kids. Fundamentally, we think that people are already able to access most of the pleasure in life, so their benefit is marginal. So on a utilitarian metric, we reduce total pain, but deontologically, we use the potential violation of other people's right to not be harmed. So on that basis, we win. Second clash then on the idea of the practical. And I think this goes beyond the individual. So if you want to hear the logic, here it is again. First, we feel that you get more crime on your side of the house because a lot of the big deterrence from law enforcement is that I will shoot you. It doesn't work on your side. Two, there's externalities, the own children that you may leave behind, the people that you will kill in the process of dying yourself. But three, that the greatest blockade to war and conflict is a fear of death. So on weighing, we win on scale. So maybe you can enjoy experimentation on your side, but because the act of dying itself is usually dangerous and it's trickle-down harm, we harm more people on your side of the house, so it's not as valid. The last person standing then is the idea of activism, but we have already flipped this in two ways. The first is that we tell you a fear of death is something that translates to the value of life, right? Because you actually fear the end of life, meaning that you need to, that the ticking time bomb reminds you must do something in the seconds that you have left. This is a sympathy that is the core of activism, because if you do not believe that this person's life is valuable, or that there's something beyond life that he can be beyond like the wall of death that he's able to enjoy, then I think this is what that you will not be as motivated to help him because his situation doesn't seem as bad to you. This is what motivates altruism in general. They said that in many they said people aren't going to speak out against like a terrible regime, but in many cases people don't speak out because there's a genuine risk that they're going to be shot. And I think again, as we proven in the status quo, bravery is still legitimate. Martyrs do exist. People can do this, but I think the genuine and great caution about being shot is a totally legitimate emotion that everyone should have because you cannot use people as a means to an end. People do not merely exist because I am here to be an activist. People exist because maybe they have a life, maybe they have a family. These are all things that they should be able to process. And we think at the same time, this debate is important to the future generations. That if I die now, even if I don't have family now, you're potentially denying everyone else in the future whom I may have interacted with and given life to. So I think far more weight needs to be given to the ending of one's life. It's not just a current time issue. But second response that we gave you to the idea of activism is that a fear of death creates a legacy effect. This is unique to our side. It's not just because life is tangible, life can end. It's because people are actively afraid that there's nothing they can do to impact the world now or leave any sort of like remembrance behind after they die, which means that they start to do good things now. And if they're not afraid of it, then they won't start. Maybe they'll feel scared on their deathbed, but it won't help. These impacts haven't been addressed, but what it means is like massive movements of income towards charitable causes that tangibly help everyone in the world and that you lose on your side of the house, but also in your daily life, simply being like kinder to others, and maybe you feel more fulfilled after you do these good things, but these are good things that you will not do on your side of the house. Lastly, then to address the idea of speculation and investment. I think on your side, you care less about cost-benefit analysis because your fear of loss matters less in general. You are more attracted by things like greed and profits, which is a direct fit on the idea of like capitalistic innovation or whatever. We think therefore you are more you are trying to attract risky and speculative investment. That is why this is problematic, because if you're going to invest recklessly in the AI bubble, the housing bubble in 2008, it's because you don't really care about the outcome, which may lead you to death, which causes significant third-party harms when the bubble pops, which leads to financial ruin and harms the most vulnerable, poor people in society. So what is the weighing there? They don't rebut this because they don't discuss how mass financial ruin is at all better than some people feeling slightly happy and more fulfilled with their life. You lead to huge amounts of immense harms. Because we think this is the greatest harm in the debate, we win on this. I'm very proud to oppose. Thanks.
Thank you, third proposition. For the final speech, now I'd like to invite Op reply.
And I feel like, am I audible?
Yes.
Okay. I want to begin my reply speech in 3, 2, 1. Since my third speaker is talking about his personal anecdotes, here's one of mine. Not too long ago, when I saw the headlines of the 100 people who died in an Air India plane crash, I felt devastated. I felt that something was incomplete. The feeling of something that was never actually meant to be. This permanence of death had come far too soon for these individual souls. This is what I thought as empathy, because I put myself in their shoes. I forced myself to accept the reality that they had met their permanent end so suddenly. I felt empathetic because of our shared, collective, and humane urge to fear death. And that one other human had to deal with this fear, and I couldn't do anything to stop it. It's this fear of death and the grief we feel when someone else meets their death that gives us inherent value to our lives and to each other's lives. And yes, sadness is bad, but this makes us cherish each other for what little time we have on here. It fuels our empathy, it drives us to care for each other and build a better society through innovation. To propose would mean to harm the inherent value of all of our lives, so I could never be prouder to oppose. 2 clashes on the individual and 1 on the society. Firstly, on fulfillment, 1 on happiness. Happiness is good because you value your life. You do stuff that you find valuable, doing stuff you truly enjoy, and doesn't have to be drugs. And I'll mention the case on deviants who find true happiness from doing drugs. The permanent which you cannot escape is coming. So you do what you want to do before you cannot do it anymore, which is after death. And next, on philanthropy, where you actually consider the happiness of others, and you consider the happiness of others because you value their life. And when you value their life, you show empathy. You need empathy to exist for philanthropy and compassion to exist in the first place. It is fundamental to the living force. Compassion is something that goes 2 ways, and understanding that both of you understand that death is going to be permanent and you both fear it, so we care for each other for what we have right now because you cannot be caring after your death. Note, this is psychological, as my third speaker mentions, so the rebuttals are just lies because that's not really how the brain works. My third speaker said, because I'm not crippled from the fear that I'll never ask my crush out and that window would expire at that point of no return, I just continue on with my life. It is something that you're psychologically able to tune out based on copium, right? Next, on legacy, which they don't deal with at all throughout their bench. You can't control your image post-death. You do good stuff to seem good. On our worst case, you can say it isn't intrinsic, but the responses that we mentioned, it's still happening in the first place, good things. And next, it's fueled by empathy, which they can't claim on their side of the house. Next, the clash on society, and this is slightly more important because they mentioned that we are okay if people do drugs and do alcohol if it makes them happy. I'm going to repackage substantives and rebuttals given from our speakers. The 2 main things we've mentioned, externalities and short-term, long-term. Because if you ask the smoker why he smokes and or if he's scared of dying of lung cancer, he would say, well, no, I'd rather die from smoking than feel my emotions right now. This is bad for a number of reasons we've mentioned, because you could be in a state of bad mental decision and make a flawed decision. You could inflict pain on people via externalities, like your 2 children and your wife, and the guy who's walking by and smells your smog and it harms his lungs. And yes, we say that you enjoy in the short term, but in the long term you suffer because you devalued your own life. Because your value of your life diminished, you suffer in the long term. And yes, maybe if you take them on our worst case scenario and say that yes, this short term suffering is great, we say that by mathematically you save more people, that is utilitarianly good. And in our counterfactual, we have the proliferation of our own narrative. The prevention of the proliferation of this anti-narrative means that you have less adoption of smoking and drugs, which is obviously very good for a society. Next, they say that war needs to exist, and yes, war exists on both sides. War that needs to happen happens in both sides. The issue is that pointless ones, which is what I tried to say, happen more on your side of the house. We just said you will have more unnecessary war. So Thanks for agreeing with that point. Ideology, as my third speaker says, can be overwhelmed because the fundamental forces of life, like survival and empathy, are so pervasive, but now they don't exist. You need the fear of death to exist so that these things don't happen. And lastly, on empathy, because when you have empathy, you do more nice things to each other. You call each other nice words and nice, cute actions of caring and keep people happy without the externality of bad hedonism. We have a better society, so as the society that cares for each other, society that values each other's lives, never been prouder to oppose. Thank you.
Thank you, Op reply for the fine remarks. Next prop reply.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Look, opposition did not defend their burden in this debate. Opposition tried to make every single piece of analysis symmetrical when it just wasn't. They said innovation only happens because people are scared of death. They said you only value your life when you're scared of death. This is not due to the fear of death. This is due to the fact that death happens. People start to write their books at the end of their lives because they know it's sake time is up. People make groundbreaking innovations and research not because they are scared of death, but because they know time is infinite. Finite. People care about dying children not because you're scared for them, but because we're empathetic, we are kind people, and we understand that state systems put them there unjustly. Don't let opposition get away with symmetricizing the entire debate for their own convenience. There are a few key things I want you to take away for our case then panel. First, opposition's burden in this debate was to prove that there's an impending sense of doom of fear when people are actively fearing death. Not that they are coping, not that they aren't thinking about it, but they are fearing death. And they never once proved why that was good and therefore they automatically lose. But our burden was to prove to you why when you significantly reduce the fear of death, that does not mean you completely reduce the fear of death. It improves people's lives and it changes their thinking. Second, social changes do happen far more on our side of the house because less people are scared that they're going to do something dangerous. Malala did it because she was super passionate about the cause and she was willing to sacrifice herself for the betterment of society. People that are scared of sacrificing their life and dying just factually will not take those risks, and that is why it's completely different. This fundamentally makes society better, and don't believe opposition when they try and say, oh, Malala was still scared of death, but she still did it because she cares about it. But even if Malala was scared of death and just had the guts to do it, she's 1 in a million. The majority of people will not do that if they're scared of death. So on the margin, we obviously win on social change. But third, people will live their lives less about fulfilling some appearance and instead about their own passion. The reason we told you it was true was because when you are not scared of death, you aren't scared that your life will be wasted and will do something for yourself. But when people are scared of dying, this won't happen because you're constantly trying to move at a fast-paced society, thinking that time is going to run out when it's not. That is the characterization from the first speech that opposition just completely chose to ignore. On the fact then that they said people will make rash decisions like doing drug and going to war, note that this was their biggest case. First, the fact that people still do drugs and go to war in the status quo shows that even when you are scared of death, you still are going to make those rash decisions. Death is not the only factor you factor in to decisions. There are a multitude of reasons why you wouldn't do drugs, like your mom being disappointed in you, like you having trickle-down effects onto your child, etc. Opposition seems to think that people will now waltz into life like it's not even valuable. But what makes life valuable is not the fear of death, but the scarcity of time. There's an extremely huge difference that opposition just chose to ignore from the very first speech that we gave. Second, though, as for war, this was just like absurd. We told you people don't go to war because it breaks governmental institution. It destroys economies. It absolutely wipes out entire countries. This is not because the fear of death. People in the military are already people willing to sacrifice their life for the country and already people that supposedly are not scared of death. So it's symmetrical. But the reason why we don't go to war 24/7 like what opposition wants to paint to you is because of the other reasons that is not about fearing death. This argument was just fundamentally flawed and filled with assertions at the very end. Ultimately, what opposition doesn't realize is that people have more than one purpose in life to be scared of death. When you're scared of death to the extent at which they had to prove, that is when the harms manifest. On our side, people still fear death, but it's significantly less, which is what they forgot, and therefore they lose.
I thank the prop reply for the final remarks as well. Let's conclude the debate for this round. Congratulations everyone for finishing the final. All of you can just cross the floor virtually and then go back to the main hall. Wait for the announcement from the OC. All the best.